All right, welcome back. My name is Robin Craig. I teach at the Stegner Center at the College of Law, and I'm here to moderate, which should be a very interesting panel on responding to catastrophic industrial accidents. We have an excellent and well-experienced panel of four who will each take about 15 minutes to give you an overview of their chosen topic, which will hopefully leave us with about 10 to 15 minutes for questions to the entire panel at the end. So I will introduce them briefly in the order they're going to speak. First up will be Charles David Nutt, who is the Director of Legal Services for Environmental Health and Safety at Huntsman International, LLC. And he will be giving an overview of the many issues that arise after a catastrophic event at an industrial facility. He'll be followed by Steve Jones, who is of counsel for Holland & Hart, who will be speaking about his experiences representing Chevron Pipeline Company during its 3 local oil spills. He'll be followed by Rich Haddock, who is Vice President of Strategic Business and U.S. Legal Affairs for Barrick Gold, who will be discussing the importance of having a plan for dealing with such emergencies. And finally, Amanda Smith, who's the Executive Director of Utah's Department of Environmental Quality, will be speaking on DEQ's role and perspective following such catastrophic events. So that will be our panel, and David, you're up.
Thank you, Robin. Good morning, everyone. As Robin indicated, I'm Dave Nutt. I'm in-house environmental counsel with Huntsman, and I'm office out of the Houston, Texas area. And a lot of what Carol talked about this morning is similar to what I was going to talk about, so I'll stray a little bit and maybe hit on some highlights of a similar type of incident that we had within Huntsman basically a year after the Texas City event. We have several facilities down in southeast Texas, including one we had at the time at Port Arthur, Texas. A fairly large facility. Chemical facility, not a refinery, not near as big as Texas City, but nonetheless a large facility that incorporates a lot of hydrocarbons and flammable products in making chemicals. And this is what the part of the complex, the light olefins unit, looked like at one point in time. This is an aerial shot following an event that we had on Saturday morning, April 29th, 2006, where we had a release of hydrocarbons that resulted in a fire. I know it's difficult to see, but you can see the massive amount of pipes and vessels that carry, for the most part, hydrocarbons, flammable products. In this case, Huntsman was more fortunate than BP. Perhaps the biggest single difference between the two events is that in the case with BP, you had a release of hydrocarbons that took time to find an ignition source. So you had a vapor cloud that grew in size until it found an ignition source, which then resulted in a large, powerful explosion. We were fortunate. And it's pure luck, which is not really something you want to rely on. But in our case, we were fortunate. When we had a pipe that failed, releasing hydrocarbons, we got an immediate spark, which instead of forming a vapor cloud, you got fire. And then we had a tremendous fire, but it didn't result in an explosion. This is the fire we had Saturday morning, taken by someone driving by the highway when it occurred. Now, the scary part is it was a Saturday morning, so it wasn't during the work week, although it is a 24/7 operation. We had 4 employees near that unit, about 150 feet away from where the pipe ruptured and the fireball then expanded in size. Unlike BP, we didn't have a pressure wave, but we did have an ever-increasing size of a fireball, which those 4 employees were able to outrun. So unlike Texas City, and I think this is the biggest difference between all the outside involvement that Texas City got versus the limited outside involvement that we had, was the absence of fatalities or injuries. And once again, it was fortuitous. Here's another picture just to give you a sense for the amount of energy, fuel that is there. What happened and I'll give you a little specifics about what happened. This is a picture. It was an 8-inch pipe. It was a warm-up line for crack gas. What you see around it is insulation, so it was an insulated pipe. Unbeknownst to us, there was a 2-foot section on a 200-foot horizontal run of pipe. And Carol mentioned numerous times process safety. It's something that since this event 8 years ago that I've learned a lot about. I'm not an engineer, but I work with our process safety experts all the time. You do not expect to find failed pipe in a straight run. You typically find failures at elbows, turns, etc. Well, in this case, you had the insulation, and our subsequent investigation found very humid in southeast Texas. There were, above this pipeline, crossing at a 90-degree angle, 2 uninsulated cold lines that would get condensation on them over a period of years. This is 27-year-old pipe. It would drip onto this insulation, and it found a point at the seam where it got in. So over 27 years, you had water get inside, and you actually got corrosion on the top of the pipeline, which over time, the thickness, because of the corrosion rate, got smaller and smaller and smaller to the point that it could not withstand the static pressure that was going on in the operation. So that's what led to the failure. This is an example of corrosion under insulation. Unlike BP, this was kind of a unique finding that was not well known in industry. And it's the term CUI, or corrosion under insulation. And you can see it here on the top of this pipeline. Not where industry experts expected to find corrosion. Another picture. What's interesting, and this goes back to the evidence preservation following an incident. You'll see this piece here in the middle. That is the actual failed piece. And the thickness, once again, got to the point where it couldn't withstand the pressure that was in the pipeline. We found that piece about 200 feet from the pipe that actually failed. And I'll show you in a picture. The top picture at the bottom of that arrow, that is the failed piece that blew. What you can't see with this picture is following this incident, you saw the pictures of the fire. It was a tremendous fire. One of the problems that we had was the fire was coming out of that 8-inch pipe, which it acted basically like a flamethrower. Then, over the course of the next 10 minutes, the fire impingement, the heat, ruptured another 20 lines holding hydrocarbons. Moreover, it heated up vessels that held as much as 700,000 pounds of fuel, which then began to vaporize and come back out of the pipe that was fractured. So we had a tremendous amount of energy and fuel being burned. Another bad fact that happened was your flare system, which is designed to control those hydrocarbons, it failed because of the fire. So we were left with a fire without the flare system to help abate it. What we ultimately did was we allowed the fire to play itself out over about a 5-day period, because if you don't do that, you then have escaping hydrocarbons that continue to keep a very volatile atmosphere and environment that creates additional danger. So one of my takeaways was you kind of deal with each emergency situation. They're all unique, and this one certainly was. I'll get to in a minute, but some of the things that Carol talked about. One of the takeaways for Huntsman on our incident and for BP's incident are really well captured in this book. It's failure to learn, and one thing that's really helpful with this book, as Carol knows, due to some of the settlements at Texas City, basically all the documents were released to the public and available. And in this case, you know, Carol and I have talked about the technical rationale and why an incident happened. This explores the organizational shortcomings that companies have from an organizational perspective, from a communications perspective. For example, at BP Texas City, the process safety expert at the plant level did not have direct lines of communication with the plant manager, did not have direct lines of communication outside of the plant structure to others within the corporate headquarters to take concerns about process safety too, if it couldn't get them resolved in-house at the plant. So if this is an area of interest for you, I would highly recommend reading this. As a matter of fact, at Huntsman, our senior managers from the CEO on down, as part of Huntsman's effort to really increase and upgrade its process safety expert, they have all read this book. And it's part of our attempt to change our culture and enhance our process safety program at Huntsman. As Carol said, it's very difficult to change culture at a large plant. Extremely difficult. And I took note when Carol, just to give you an example, when Carol mentioned right before the incident at Texas City, they had printed off, and they were still on the printer, the procedures to take the unit down or to take the unit up. A lot of people will look at that and say, well, the operators failed. Having now done this for several years and been involved in several organizations, I have a totally different outlook. I don't see it as the operators failed. What the operators did that day, that's what they do every day. So what happens to allow the operators to not follow procedures, to take shortcuts? That's a culture. And the company, the organization, the management allow that to happen. So one of the things that I think is really important when you're involved in these incidents, and it was a learning experience for me, is there is never one root cause to an incident. There are multiple root causes. For example, you could look at the Huntsman incident. You could say it was corrosion under insulation caused it. That's one of the root causes. What caused it to fail at that time? Plant was in a upset condition. Why was the plant in an upset condition? Well, there were some other problems that had happened 2 years earlier that led to the plant being in upset condition. So there are multiple root causes when you look at these. And the one thing that I just wanted to stress with this book is that there are, if you really want to look at this and learn about incidents and how to avoid them, looking at the company's organization, its communications, is a critical component to that, because it's not always a technical issue or a technical solution. I've got a couple minutes, just real quick. Like Carol, when we had our incident, first federal agency that contacted us was the FBI, once again to see if it was a terrorist incident. One of the differences that we had was, if you're involved in an internal investigation, it's critical, as Carol said, to get great team members who bring expertise to the equation. Fortunately, at Huntsman, we put on the ground within 24 hours what I thought was a very good team comprised of a senior manager who was a chemical engineering major, had run plants before as kind of the lead. We had several EHS experts, several engineers. I was on it, and then we hired some outside consultants with expertise in metallurgy and some other things. What that team did was we worked extremely hard. We couldn't access the site because of the risk that was still there from leaking hydrocarbons, vapors, the stability of it. So for the first 2 weeks, we looked at data, but we got high-resolution photography from cranes to take pictures to allow us to do some insightful investigation before we could access the unit. We did that, and I think we did a really good job of getting on the ground and getting up to speed and learning quickly, because within a week, CSB actually deployed, Chemical Safety Board deployed to the site. They spent a week there. One of the first things that we did, and I don't know if this is always good advice, but it certainly worked for us. We were very transparent, very forthcoming. We sat down with the CSB. We brought them up to speed on what we had done, what we had learned, where we were, what we were investigating. We spent a week with them, and at the end of the week, they came to us and said, "We've concluded we will never have the expertise that you do to do this investigation. You've been very transparent. You promised to give us a copy of your report when you're done, and we're out of here." So unlike Texas City, we didn't have outside agencies there on site impacting our investigation. We were able to do it ourselves, which was very, very helpful. So with that, I'm running out of time. Be around to answer questions, but once again, thanks for your time, and be more than happy to answer any questions if you have what we're doing here. Thank you.
There we go. I'm Steve Jones. I have, and I do actually think this, the honor of representing Chevron. And what I'm here today to do is tell you what I think is the right way to deal with a very bad situation. What Chevron had 3 spills in 3 years. One in 2010, another one just almost at the turn of the year. Red Butte 1 was the 2010. Red Butte 2 was a valve failure, but it didn't reach water. And then in April of 2013, the Willard Bay spill took place. And I got the job of negotiating with my colleagues over here. The thing about my talk, the people I worked with from the state and the others are talking here, so I got to be honest. I can't, be an advocate, because they'll call me on it. But what made my job easier was the approach that Chevron took in response to those. And that's really what I want to talk about, is why that makes sense, both from a corporate responsibility, which I think is inherent in that corporate culture, but also for someone in my chair, why it makes it a lot easier. So if we can, where do I aim? There we go. Unlike the Texas City and the Huntsman spill, this was, you can say act of God, weather accident. What happened is, this is a Rocky Mountain Power transformer station. This is the same pole. This pole, wind caused that pole to contact those lines, and the current went down the pole, down here, through the ground. And these fence posts, the fence has been taken down, but at the time this took place, this was the fence around this substation. And they were buried 3 inches from the pipeline. So that's, you want to talk about the root cause, that's the root cause, but the precipitating cause was, it wasn't a lightning strike, but it had the same effect. This is the bottom of that fence post. It was 3 inches away from this pipeline, and that's the result of the grounding through that pole, down through the fence post to the pipeline. That's how big the hole is. 800 gallons went out of that, 800 barrels, not 800 gallons, 800 barrels went out of that hole. That was that big. So this took place the spill took place on June 11th. This is June 18th, 1 week to the day. This is a letter that came from Chevron to all of the property owners and other people who were along Red Butte Creek. What happened is that pipeline ran right to the side of Red Butte Garden, and so when the spill came, it went right into the creek. I mean, I went up and looked at the site, and I don't think you could have physically figured out a place to have a confluence of a substation, a power line, and the water. It was like it was designed that way. But a week after the spill, Chevron wrote to everybody that was impacted and said, we will clean up the damage. We're going to take full responsibility for the cleanup, including any property that may have been affected. So they're on record. PHMSA is on site at this point. The Command Control Center, which involves EPA, State of Utah, DEQ, they're all there working. But before any of that had happened, this is the approach that Chevron took. They immediately mobilized a huge team to do the cleanup of the creek. This bridge right here is in the Garden Park Ward. The LDS chapel that's on Yale Avenue, Red Butte Creek flows right through the back of their property. And because it's so picturesque, it's used for, well, I'll show you what it's used for in about 3 slides. The oil, and it was crude in this instance, went all the way down Red Butte Creek and emptied into Liberty Park, and Liberty Pond and Liberty Park, and some of the avian species at the aviary were there. Again, immediate response, and you can see I had to discard tens of slides of this cleanup because it was, there's part of the pond and mobilization of heavy equipment, and there's booms all over the place. Here's what it looks like today. So the cleanup was very successful, and in fact, I think the city of Salt Lake would tell you that the park looked better after the spill. Not that you'd want to do that as the way you'd get an improvement, but the park looked better after the spill than it did before. In addition, a number of people who had property that abutted Red Butte Creek had impacts, and as a result of doing the cleanup, a lot of their property got improved. This is the same site. These are actually cement bags that were used as a, let's say, not an ill-designed attempt to shore up they've just been destroyed. There was all that kind of erosion. This is what happened after. They just rebuilt the whole channel. And what you don't know is this thing across the top is the foundation of somebody's house. So it actually didn't matter whether or not that took place. Again, here's Red Butte Creek. Before, you can see the bank erosion on this side. Stuff is falling into the creek. After the cleanup, not only did the water get cleaned up, but they put all this rockery in. There's some new concrete to shore up the shoreline. This is what I wanted to show you. This is the same the Garden Park Ward. I love this picture because it's just so amazing. There's this woman getting her wedding pictures taken in that, and that ward is used for weddings so often that you can't have a wedding there unless you actually live in the ward or are related to somebody. So Mr. Johnson, my friend of 24 hours who I met last night, got the job of being a wedding planner because there were a number of people who couldn't have their wedding receptions in the Garden Park Ward because the creek had oil in it. So how many weddings did you do, Don?
Oh, I think it was like 40, I think, if I remember.
That was what I was told, is it was between 30 and 40. And, I'm sure she's not happy that she's getting her wedding pictures in the back of booms and a worker, but this wedding went to Log Haven. A number of them went to the Grand America. So, again, not how you'd want, but not the worst result in the world, especially if you, as I can tell you from experience, are the one writing the check for that wedding. I don't want to focus too much on the cost, except to just show that this was before settlement. When they said, we'll take responsibility, we'll do the right thing, we will clean it up, this was without anybody directing. There was no government saying, you shall do this. This was done voluntarily by Chevron before I got involved in negotiating the penalties and the other mitigation projects. Here's Willard. I'm skipping over Red Butte 2 because it was a valve failure. It didn't reach water. It's just not a sexy spill, and so, but Willard was. So on April 13th, 2013, a low-frequency electronic weld pipeline had a corrosion issue that eventually resulted in about a 8-inch long seam failure. It's roughly a 1/4 inch wide, 400 barrels. So to show what happened here, I just wanted to do some before and after pictures. This is the pipeline at Willard runs right by I-15. I mean, it's 200 yards, if that. And so this was diesel, came down and went. It didn't get to the bay. I know Walt and I don't agree with that on that point, but our view is that the diesel that was in the bay was not as result of this spill, but that's by the by. The point of the cleanup is it was a very strong attempt to prevent anything like that happening. The spill was contained in 24 hours. People were on site immediately. A command and control center was again developed, just like there was with the Red Butte spill, involving EPA, DEQ. The Bureau of Reclamation was involved there because Willard Bay is a reclamation property. I did not know that. There's the canal in the middle. These are called pom-poms. What they are is material that's stripped out of a boom and then just left, and it just soaks the stuff up. There's what that same creek looks like after they're done. Okay, here is, the reason I put this slide in is because they didn't want to exacerbate the problem, wherever there were people that would work and would be tramping around in their boots, they would put absorbent pad down. So they'd make pathways for cleanup workers to work, and then they would decon, their term, not mine, after every shift. So you'd come to work, you'd put on your stuff, they'd have paths for you to work, and when you were done, you'd come out of work, take off your dirty clothes, go through a wash, so you weren't moving the stuff outside of the spill area. That's that same stream after the cleanup. The spill happened in April. The cleanup, this is the next season, the next spring, and you can see how quickly the vegetation returned. This is the beach. Now, one of the interesting things about the Willard spill is the beaver ponds. For those of you who've been here longer than a couple years, there were 5 beavers in that park, and they had done enough work that they had created beaver ponds which held some of the diesel in the standing water that were created by the beaver dams. They were nominated for Citizens of the Year, the 5 beavers were in 2013. As a result of that, there wasn't much, if any, diesel that got to the bay or the beach area. But to prevent that from happening, the old sand was taken out, an entire new beach worth of sand was brought in, and that's what it looks like now. In addition, and I think this is important, just like the improvements to the private property that was happening in Red Butte, the company went over and beyond just cleaning up the spill. This parking area was built, this parking area was resurfaced and relined, an ADA compliant trail with all these beams were put in, again, not with a gun to the head. This was not somebody, a regulator, requiring that. This was just, we're going to do the right thing. We're going to go above and beyond. So here we've got about, depending on who you count, whose numbers you take, 22 to, I've had somebody tell me 24 million, but 1.2 over and above cleanup. This is not cleanup costs. This is stuff over and above. So here's why this makes sense when you're in my shoes, because I get to come in now after and talk with Craig and talk with Wald and talk with Amanda's people, and it gives me a good story to tell. Because of the Red Butte quick action, the company was able to settle with Salt Lake City. We did lost use damages with them. We also did remediation and did their cleanup. We were able to settle with the University of Utah, similar, lost use damages, did a remediation agreement. There was a settlement with the LDS Church, both for the Garden Park property, and there's another stake center that's just up by Sunnyside Park. And then after, in 2013, we negotiated, or this is for Red Butte, this happened in 2011. There was a penalty with the state, but also part of the settlement was that Chevron would fund $600,000 of mitigation projects where people came in and bid. They didn't even have to be related. Most of them were, but people could just come in and spend Chevron's money. So that was part of the way that settlement was done. Willard Bay, we settled the Parks Department's lost use damages, and then we did a settlement that was similar to the one we did at Red Butte, where there was a penalty paid, but then we also paid for, again, I can't remember, it was $600,000 or $650,000 of mitigation projects. We didn't do the federal penalty until the state stuff had all been done. And so as a result of that, when we negotiated the federal penalties, the state penalties had been paid, the settlements had been funded, the mitigation projects had been funded, and we were able to claim credit for that because the federal government said, okay, you've already done the right thing here. And no, that's what I just said. We got penalties for those, for the penalties and the mitigation. We got credit with the feds. So here's the response. I had to stand in the same room and present this settlement to the water board on Willard Bay and make sure that it was publicly acceptable. There were public comments on that settlement, and I thought a lot of them were going to be, you know, don't let Chevron off the hook, here's another, you know. There was not one single comment that way. There were a lot of comments that said we want the mitigation money to stay in the Willard Basin. And then there were also comments from, this is the guy who runs Willard Bay State Park, James Morgan, sorry. This is him being quoted in the Standard Examiner. And there were a number of public comments that said, ironically, I'd hate for this to happen, but if this is the result, maybe we should have a spill every year. I literally saw those comments. This is the mayor of the city of Willard, who was trying to get a park approved and trying to get it funded. He was able to use some of those mitigation funds, and this was his comment post funding of the park as what he's going to name the park, which I just thought that was classic. So here's the takeaways. Stuff happens. And if you're in the stuff business, where you're in a business where it's likely to happen, if you do the right thing, it's the right thing to do. It makes it a lot more easy for a person in my shoes or in Don's shoes who had to be in the newspaper or on the TV to say, okay, yes, this is a bad situation, but we're going to step up, take responsibility, and go above and beyond. And then after you're doing the negotiation, it just makes it that much better. So I'm out of time. Happy to answer questions when we're done, but thank you for your attention.
All right, these kind of dissections of these incidents is fascinating, and and rather than do that myself, I've just got a few kind of ramblings about what happens or what you do in the lead up to these things, and what happens in the hours afterwards. You know, the first point that everybody should get from this, and I suspect BP had it, and I'm pretty sure Chevron had it when this happened, is, you know, best practice is you got to have a crisis management plan. You know, and what is that? I mean, it's not, and there's lots of kind of response plans and things you have to have by regulation or statute, you know, like under EPCRA or something like that. That's not what this is. A crisis management plan is really what the companies do in the aftermath of an incident to, I think, in my view, to retain their license to operate. In our case, in the mining industry, we have a lot of mines. They're separate. They're not like a refinery where you've got 30 different units. But we have the same kind of activities happening. If something bad happens, we need those mines to continue, and we need to respond to them and make the community comfortable with what's going on. And while a crisis management plan is kind of the overarching plan that has all these other things like, you know, regulatory reporting and all that stuff hung into it, and even the initial first responders, it's broader than that. And so, you know, I've got here, which is this is just a pretty generic outline of what should be in a crisis management plan. This is ours, and there's nothing magic about it. There's lots of different ones. They're off the shelf. But the reality is no business should use an off-the-shelf plan. You should have your own. It should relate directly to your business. And while this is a good outline of the kind of stuff that's in it, and the kind of stuff that can be in a plan, they can differ, and they can look different. Ours literally is a notebook that sits on my shelf, and it has the steps we go through in the event of an incident. We literally use that on a regular basis to do drills. My colleague Jim Alto was just in a corporate-wide drill just the other day. I didn't even know it was happening, and I had some things I had to do that morning, and suddenly I couldn't find anybody. Everybody was in a crisis drill. So we knew what it was and we knew how it would work. And at the end of this book, and to me this is actually the part I actually use the most, is it's like a phone book. And we have a property by property list of key phone numbers, and it's got regulatory phone numbers in it. It's got, it's got the county commissioners, but it's got a whole bunch of other phone numbers in there too. It's got the local newspapers. It's got it's got all the politicians that matter, both, on a state, a local, a federal level with respect to that facility. And that kind of becomes a really important tool for people to use in the aftermath of an incident. Since this is a law school thing, I'm going to focus a little bit on kind of the nuts and bolts and some of the things that the in-house counsel should play, and that's my perspective anyway, in this thing. And the bottom line is, while this document isn't really a legal document, in-house counsel should have a pretty substantial role in drafting it. And the reason I say that is because in the event of an incident, that drafting and that input you may have into that document may be the only input you get for hours after the incident. And so you really get your input before it ever happens, when you identify things that should be happening. And when you're drafting that thing, and helping because this is going to be drafted by communications people, by safety people, by environmental people, by a broad range of people in the company. But what you're looking for as a lawyer is, you're looking for compliance with legal requirements and those kind of regulatory relationships that are important. You're looking for things like document preservation, privilege, information flow, and frankly, as a lawyer, you should just be looking to help that document work, to bring all the pieces together, thinking through how it works. I know my slides are probably out of order. They are. I just want to address a couple of elements of a plan, and some of these may seem like they're silly or simple, but to me, one of the key elements is a command center. When something happens, everybody needs to know where to go. And if you don't have that figured out, then people are just running around. And they're just showing up wherever they show up, and if they don't know where to go, then you're going to have communications problems. So on each of our mine sites, we have a designated command center. This is an example of one of our mine sites. There's nothing magic about it. It's a room. It's got some tables in it. It's got telephones. It's got whiteboards. And if something happens, everybody who has an obligation to be part of that team goes there. It establishes who the incident commander is, our plan does. And so when something happens, people aren't running around trying to figure out what happens. They know what to do immediately. I mentioned the contact list. I just can't emphasize how important having a list is, and having the people that you have to call for a given property. And in big businesses, you've got properties all over the place, and those lists differ. And we have a person who spends a big chunk of time making sure that all those contacts are up to date. So some of the specific issues I want to talk about that come up, I want to refer here to a recent incident happened in British Columbia. It was the Mount Poly mine tailings failure. This tells you something that's kind of interesting about these kinds of incidents. It was a terrible incident. And it still is under investigation, and there's been all kinds of recriminations and things in the media about who did it and why did it happen and who made the mistake. But what I think is interesting is this. And this slide was prepared by a consultant for ICMM, which is an international association of metals industry. And what I think is kind of interesting about this is social media. one of the things that I just got to emphasize, and I've seen this change, is when an incident happens, it goes crazy on social media. We've had incidents on our mine sites where literally people in town know before anybody else on the site because somebody's texting immediately. It's the rate at which information now spreads is stunning, and it creates a new, very difficult paradigm for a company who's responding to an incident, because getting information out is critical. But getting information out correctly kind of takes time. And there's a real tension here because now the pressure to get information out is so much faster than it's ever been. And what this slide really shows is, in the days after the incident, it just kind of shows the number of tweets. And this was just tweets going out about different events that happened. And then you see it spiking as different things happened after the incident in the days, in the few weeks after the incident. So giving consideration in your plan and your communications to how fast you get information out and how you deal with the social media pressures is really, I think, really important. Another thing I think is really important after an incident, and you heard Carol talk about it, it's something that happens over time, but as soon as an incident happens, you have to identify the right experts to call and get into the property. And that's kind of part of having the command center. That's part of having all the pieces of the company in one place talking at the same time. And sometimes when we have an incident and you've got, one of the things you do with that command center is you just open a phone line. And you've got a phone line there, and people are listening in real time for hours on end. But when the question comes up, who do we need here? What kind of expert do we need? Those are really important early discussions. And, they brought in different kind of experts. I thought it was interesting that they brought in an evidence preservation expert, like within the first 24 hours. Great call. But that wouldn't happen if people weren't talking. All right. Another thing, that I think everybody knows, but this is critical in the first hours, I think, after an incident, and I think who the spokesperson is changes over time, but you got to have the right spokesperson. And those of us here in Utah have seen examples of when people didn't have the right spokesperson. And all I can say is, for crying out loud, it's not your CEO. I'm not naming names, but it's not your CEO. You've got to have somebody who isn't in control of the situation. You have to have somebody who's not operating the facility. It's got to be a professional spokesperson who can get away with saying, "Hey, got a problem? You got a question? I don't have the answer. I'll get back to you." Just a couple of other comments. One thing, and Carol mentioned it. It's critical, I think, in an incident where you have injuries and fatalities, to have somebody designated to deal with the people immediately. Bringing family in, getting them put up in hotels, if you got fatalities or serious injuries, making sure that, the salary continuation is there because, paychecks were due the next day or whatever. All that stuff is really important. And why? Well, first of all, it's the right thing to do. But second of all, it reminds the families, in my view, there really is a practical consideration. It reminds the families that hopefully, that their loved ones were in a place they wanted to be. These are their colleagues. These are their friends. In our company, there's a group of HR people who that's their job. And, if you want to bring the family in and have them be part of the company when this is going on, not have them be out there in, where the plaintiff's lawyers are coming after him, the media's coming after him. They're all going to come after him anyway. But I think it's really important to treat the families right. A couple of other comments here. In-house and outside counsel. If you're in-house counsel, you better make this decision long before an incident ever happens. In BP's case, I call Carol. But you better know who the first lawyer you want that facility to call is going to be. In some cases, it may be you. I mean, my background is in environmental law. I've been the environmental vice president of the company before. If it's an environmental incident, I want them calling me. But I have outside counsel that works for me in the MSHA, you know, the health and safety stuff in mining. I want them calling them first. I don't want them calling me first. And they know that, but that's the relationship I have with that outside counsel, and that's got to be established in advance, and outside counsel has to know how that relationship's going to work. In the MSHA circumstance, when we have a fatality, those guys, they just come. They don't wait for me. They show up. They just come, and they brief me when it's time to be briefed. And they know in my relationship with them that I only want to hear from them when there's a lull on the site, and it doesn't matter if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, when it's quiet and they don't need to respond to the first responders and to the agencies and people who are on site, then they can call me and talk to me. Another thing, you know, and just kind of information flow and document control, you know, privilege and accuracy of information is so important. The best incidents I've ever seen, you know, and I tell people this, and I don't know why people won't listen, but telephones still work. We don't have to use email for absolutely everything. Using email in the wake of an incident is a crisis for the company. That's terrible because you never have the facts right, and we all know we're too quick in email, we characterize things too nonchalantly, we characterize things incorrectly. That's why we have in the command center, we have an open phone line that just sits there. Don't use email. Don't create that stuff, because I can guarantee you those emails are going to be inaccurate in the hours after an incident, and they'll say things that are damning. It just shouldn't happen. The best incidents I've seen is literally where guys just took over a floor of a building and they used all the whiteboards, and they just kept information on the whiteboards. They'd update the information as facts would become clearer. You know, if something's wrong up there, you just erase it and you correct it. I mean, it's a great way to handle an incident. You know, and again, I'm focusing my comments, and it's time for me to stop here, but I'm focusing my comments and my thoughts here on what happens in just the few hours afterwards. You know, in the longer term, when it's time to actually write the reports, the written reports that go to regulatory agencies, the written reports that go wherever, whether it's to federal boards or the state agencies and things, that's a whole different kind of kettle of fish for lawyers, and they have a heavy role in that. But in an incident, sometimes the best thing for the lawyer to do, is just quietly listen and observe. And if you see something running off the rails, then you've got to speak up. But the reality is you've got to let the company do its job, and the facts are the facts. Because that's, unfortunately, when something goes wrong, that's how it is.
Good morning. Well, I feel sort of like one of these things is not like the other. Now you get to hear some of the same stories from the regulatory perspective, from the state regulatory perspective, which is probably a little bit different. I think we have some different challenges, and frankly, it's not something that we generally think about every day. We do have a few people in our organization who do, which is very helpful. But overall, it seems to be that start and stop kind of issue where we go about our daily lives and then suddenly there's something that's a catastrophe that we have to respond to, and we all have to brush up fairly quickly on what it is that we need to do. So I'm just going to quickly walk through what authorities we do have, the roles that we play, and then the fun part, which is kind of walking back through some specific examples, and finally close with what do we think are there gaps in our regulatory authority given some of the things that we've dealt with in the last few years. So first, we have kind of a haphazard, I would say, overlay, and you'll hear more. We have a couple of our assistant attorney generals here who are speaking later, but we sort of patch together authorities depending on the type of incident that we're responding to. This Hazardous Substance Mitigation Act in Title 19, Chapter 6 is probably our strongest authority. It gives the executive director of the department the most authority to call an emergency, access funds, and then hold a responsible party liable for those costs. If substance gets into water, then we have a whole lot more authority under the Utah Water Quality Act in 19-5. Then, of course, if it's an underground storage tank, that opens up a whole other area of authorities that the state can use, and we'll talk more about that as we get into the specifics on Gunnison, actually. So what's the role of DEQ? We are not first responders. We are often confused with first responders. We do have an incident notification process. We brought stakeholders together a few years ago and decided to beef that up. We have what we call duty officers, so we do have somebody at DEQ who is always available, who is taking home a phone, whose role is basically notification. So that's an online system that allows us to track and follow up and make sure that there are closure on spills. We also work, if in the case of a large event, we work as part of the unified command structure, run usually by EPA, who I would say in all of the incidences that I've been involved in since being in this position, they have done an excellent job. They get people here quickly, they know how to get put together an EOC, and they make it really easy for the state to participate as well as other partners. Just a little bit, I thought the presentations before me were excellent, and the last one sort of describing, Rich Haddock's describing what a company would do. Of course, the EOC on that level runs very similarly, I would think, to what happens on site in a company, but I wanted to kind of highlight two things. One is that from the state's perspective and what DEQ has to offer is that we provide technical staff 24 hours a day until the EOC director determines, the timeline that people need to be there. We also make sure that we have a media staff person there to be the spokesperson for DEQ, and then they determine on site who will be the spokesperson for that incident. And I will say again that, and echo what he said, that the role of social media is just made that more important, and it makes that collaboration and the truing of information even more important. We've seen a few things, where we end up putting wrong information out, and not only does it come back to kind of bite you as a regulatory agency or a company, but it confuses the citizens and can create a lot of fear because suddenly they don't have that confidence in the people who are supposed to be in charge. So moving on to examples. Gunnison, some of you might remember a little bit of a personal story. In August 2007, I had just started working for Governor Huntsman as an advisor to him, and I remember the phone call coming in about the Gunnison spill, and the governor was a day out of rotator cuff surgery, and if any of you have had that, it's really painful. And he and his chief of staff flew to Gunnison and were on site immediately talking to people. We responded from the agency, I was not here at that time, but from environmental response and remediation. When people started to smell vapors, they quickly checked the inventory of a local station and found that 19,000 gallons, that there was evidence of loss. They removed the tanks, they pulled the tanks out, and then they saw some of the damage. So DEQ's authority, again, we went back to the ability of the executive director to declare an emergency and start work immediately. Oh, I'm going to go back. I thought at this point we might need a little comic relief. This probably still hangs in Gunnison. I haven't been down there. But I put this up, and I use it as a reminder to myself that the people who live in these communities are incredibly impacted, and they want answers, and they want their government, and usually the government closest to them, to understand and to be there to help them through it and to make sure that they are dealt with equitably. Some folks in Gunnison clearly don't feel that way, and we've had endless meetings with them. I had been down there many times to meet with the mayor, et cetera. But clearly they still feel that more needs to be done. So just to give you some perspective on this, it was a gas tank. It got into some kind of underground pathways and was able to spread pretty quickly. The land, if you've never been to Gunnison, is mostly agriculture, a lot of fields. And so a lot of impact both in the town and in the fields. One issue that was interesting that was sort of after the fact was that because it was an emergency, I mean, this may have been leaking out for a period of time, but when it was discovered that there actually was a leak and it was pretty ubiquitous in the area, things started to move really, really quickly. And so the company came in very quickly. They started to do removal. They started to implement a quick plan. And I'm not to this day sure whether the city waived their zoning requirements or if it was just sort of unknown. It's a small town. But zoning requirements were not followed, so there was a lot of excavation done. That's actually the hole in the tank. And so they moved really quickly. There were some homes. There was a home that had to be removed. And again, what happens in these situations, just to bring it back to a personal point, is that there was a family that lived in an area that was very impacted. They actually could no longer live in their home. They moved out. They were still responsible for their mortgage. So they were paying mortgages in two places or paying house payments in two places. They were trying to recover from the company. The company made promises to pay their mortgage. That happened for a period of time, and then it didn't happen for a period of time. And so those people, understandably, are coming to the department. We have the only hook to making this better and expecting that the department actually has the authority to collect those payments, which is pretty tenuous in DEQ's authority. So that's a picture of their home, some of the excavation. On Main Street, this is where some of the zoning issues happened, really impacted later on what the town wanted to do with sort of a revitalization of downtown, their ability to put planter boxes in, turned into a legal and financial morass for the mayor and the city council as they tried to abide by their own zoning and also by requirements of UDOT and others in terms of working on their roadways because the initial zoning had not been followed and decisions were made and things moved really quickly, which at the time makes sense, but sometimes looking back, having it not being taken into account can be very problematic. Where this leaves the town and DEQ is that we're basically working under our statutory authority under the tank spill. And what the state can require them to do is what's called a CAP, a corrective action plan. Now there's not a lot to that authority. And we feel at Environmental Response Remediation that we really pushed our authority in terms of what we asked of the company to the full extent. It's currently under appeal, so I will not go into details about that. So we've had a lot of discussions about should that be fleshed out a little bit in terms of what the state can actually do in these situations and what they can ask from the responsible party. Another kind of issue that complicates Gunnison is that the landowners actually settled with the company, and the state was not a part of that settlement. So there were certain rights and responsibilities that were taken off the table in that settlement that the state was not part of, and we actually didn't have full access to what those negotiations were. But then the community still expected that the state should hold that responsible party to certain things in our CAP. This is one of those things I think you do a complete case study on all of the different implications, but I would say that there is not this didn't go well for anybody, and it still is not going well. And perhaps some further guidance or some further, definitions around authorities and how plans are set up would not be a bad way to proceed. So moving from Gunnison to Chevron, and I'm not going to retread too much of what was said earlier. but just wanted to talk about the 2010 spill into Red Butte Creek. It's kind of a personal thing for me. I was remember that morning really well in June. I was actually on a run up on Red Butte on the Shoreline Trail with my dog, and there were helicopters flying back and forth, and so I thought, something's going on. Is there like a loose convict? Maybe I should go home. So I went home, and I actually live across the street from Red Butte, from the Garden Park ward that was in many of those photos. So I drove home, and I had smelled something in the morning, when I got up to leave, but by the time that I got home, it was, make tears come out of your eyes kind of smell. But I didn't go look at the creek. I just thought, wow, there must be tarring a road nearby or something. So it took, I think it was a Saturday morning, and then I got a call from, I think, Walt Baker, our director of water quality, and then Brent Everett from Environmental Response Remediation, and they started filling us in. Again, when these things happen, the information isn't always correct. We had no idea how much oil had gone into the creek. Pretty sure they knew where it was coming from, I think, thanks to those helicopters, but you're trying to, and you immediately start getting press calls and trying to look at the authority. EPA had someone here, I think, within hours of that, and they set up an EOC. And I want to compliment Chevron, and Dan was here at that time. They were immediately on top of the situation, getting people out to start cleaning it with contractors. And that was continuous. In fact, it's still continuous. I think we just had an incident last week where somebody smelled vapors again. They had cleaned out a culvert over in the Garden Park ward. One of the things that was a little bit unexpected, and here are some of the details, and you heard some of the details of the actual spill, is the issue of air quality. We had families immediately calling the governor's office, calling our office, asking if we could do real-time site air quality monitoring in people's homes, along the creek, et cetera, because people were instantly concerned about their health, about their children's health. There were lots of stories about what was happening. And that, I will say, we were fairly unprepared to deal with. Our Division of Air Quality is really good at having EPA-recognized monitors and knowing what the ambient air quality is. We were not set up to have monitors that we could mobilize quickly and get results back from quickly, which was an area where I think after that we've done a little bit better in organizing with local health districts, kind of who's on first, who's going to take responsibility, and how are we going to talk about that together. So there's, you saw a picture like this already. That's the Chevron Red Butte spill, again, down by Liberty. I think these are the second spill. But again, this is really a joint effort. This is a lot of people with a lot of different expertise coming together, all hands on board. So one thing that this is kind of gaps in our authority. It creates a lot of tension on a regulatory agency that's pretty lean like ours is, because we don't do this every day. We have to take people off other things and put them on it. My red light's flashing, so I'm going to go through this really quickly. So in our spills report, the majority of the spills that we have in the state, large and small, are petroleum products. Unless those products get to water, we have very limited authority in terms of collecting payment from the facilities for the time we spend on it or issuing violations. We also have no authority over above ground storage tanks. We got one in Varon right now that's leaking, and they don't belong to the trust fund, and until they start to leak, the division does not have authority to regulate them. And a lot of facilities are putting above ground storage tanks in now because they're less expensive. Not necessarily a bad thing, but fall outside the purview of the division. And then just a general pipeline issue that we kind of co-regulate amongst a couple different entities. So thank you, and I'll leave time for questions.
Okay, we because our did stay on time. We do have about 10 minutes for questions. So are there questions for individual speakers, for the panel as a whole? Go ahead.
My question is for Mr. Haddock. I was disappointed, to your point, your position that stuff happens. It seemed like a lot of what we heard about today was a result of corrosion. And you're probably aware that just 10 days ago, the Chemical Safety Board issued a final report regarding the Chevron leak in Richmond, California, that put 15,000 people to medical treatment. That also was corrosion. And it looks like there's a pattern of a failure to respond to actual risks. It seems that you're bringing forward a position that that's fine as long as you know how to respond to it, because stuff will happen, rather than getting ahead of the ball here and adopting inherently safer technologies.
I think you, well, first of all, I think you're directing the question to me, not to Mr. Haddock. Is that right? I'm Steve Jones. I'm the Chevron guy.
I'm happy to answer too. But
Mr. Haddock got my attention. Some things he said, but I did want to direct this.
No, that, first of all, the reference to stuff happening was with respect to Red Butte. I mean, that was not an anticipated, nor do I don't know how you could have prevented the wind blowing that transformer into the line. With respect to corrosion, every one of those lines has cathodic protection. And every one of those lines has, it's called smart pigging. I don't want to get too far down in the weeds. But it's not like those lines are put in and then just say, well, too bad, we're not going to worry about them at all. They're inspected regularly and rigorously, and we have to, part of the regulatory response we had to do to PHMSA, that stands for the Pipeline Hazardous Material and Safety Administration, is to say, here's what our maintenance procedure is, here's what our investigation was. You do a root cause analysis, you present that to them. So I would actually respectfully disagree with you with respect to saying, what the hell? That's just not at all what's going on. With respect to the idea, can you get out ahead of it? That I agree with you. I think that that's absolutely a necessary function. I will tell you that as a result of the Willard breach, that the company undertook a complete corporation-wide inspection, and that's just now wrapping up on low-frequency electronic weld pipelines because of just exactly what you're talking about. So I don't want to sound like we're cavalier, but some of the instances you've heard about today were not they were a result of something happening. That doesn't mean you don't take preventive action. With respect to that, I completely agree with you.
Then do you disagree with the conclusions of the Chemical Safety Board that Chevron has a cavalier attitude towards safety?
Yes, I do.
Rich, did you want to add anything?
well, I'd just say, you know, I wasn't here to talk about the systems and about, you know, process safety and the environmental audits and all the things that we do to try to prevent accidents and incidents. But things unfortunately do happen, whether it's a bus sliding off the road or whether it's a vessel rupturing or something. I was here to talk about what happens when it does happen. I know there are panels later in the day where one of my colleagues will talk about, you know, our systems where we're trying to prevent these things from happening.
Okay. Other questions? Clarissa.
Are you talking to Huntsman or me?
That's a good question. I mean, since that time, that was really an enlightening event for all of industry, given where the corrosion occurred, which was in one of the least susceptible spots. So as a result of that, I can speak for Huntsman itself, and I think a lot of industry is, there's a much more robust processes in place. A lot of the terms that Carol used about process safety, there are risk-based inspection mechanisms. And Oftentimes, for example, what Huntsman did is we actually went in and removed existing insulation to inspect. And so there are mechanisms that you can do to, and then also, let me just say that typically with these plants, as Carol mentioned, the biggest risk at these facilities is during startup and shutdown. They're oftentimes, particularly some of the chemical plants that I'm familiar with, will oftentimes run for 4 or 5 years in between what they call turnarounds and inspections, which is the time when you bring the plant down in a controlled manner, and then you may spend 4, 6, 8 weeks doing repairs, preventive maintenance that has been on a timetable scheduled for the next T&I. So that's kind of in a big picture the mechanism for that. But when we have incidents like this, that's a learning for all of industry. It was learning for Huntsman. So you then put in additional measures and steps to address those during future turnarounds and inspections and in your risk-based maintenance program. So we're always learning. We're always trying to do better. I can say emphatically that for Huntsman, our process safety program and capabilities today versus 8 years ago, it's night and day. We've made a tremendous improvement. We've spent a lot of resources, education, and there's been quite a culture change within the company that is the company recognizes that is the biggest risk to Huntsman.
Yes, sir.
If I can ask Mr. Jones, are there any studies dealing with the safety of pipelines versus old cars, trucks, tankers?
You're talking about for transport?
Yes.
There are, and there are also ongoing. Anybody who's watched the news, you've seen what happened in Quebec, and you've seen what's happened in the Bakken. And one of the biggest, and PHMSA came, and as a result of the Bakken spill, it put some new regulations in place, as did the STB, the Surface Transportation Board, which regulates the railroads. One of the biggest questions right now is, do you do rail transport of crude and other petroleum byproducts, or the underground pipeline grid has been in place in some instances since the 40s. That doesn't mean it's all that old, but my point is transport by rail it's not the new kid in town, but it certainly is not what the industry did previously. And as a result of that, yes, there are ongoing studies, and certainly with respect to rail, the 2 incidents that happened just this last year have just heightened that. It's not unique to rail. There's tanker studies ongoing. There's studies with respect to vapor within tankers and how you deal with that. There's studies that are ongoing with respect to offloading of product at depots, rail depots. So the answer to your question is yes, underscore, bold, italics.
Any results so far? I understand there's ongoing, but
Well,
I'm thinking of Keystone too, also.
Well, and you've also got the one up in the North Slope. That is the existing technology that is the one that has the longest life, the longest history, and the longest result of data with respect to that. It's also the one that, because the infrastructure is already in place, is probably the cheapest right now. That doesn't mean that it won't be. But the difference between a pipeline spill, and I think it's illustrated by the things that we're talking about today, in both Red Butte 2 and in Willard, an underground pipeline release, albeit an environmental catastrophe, did not result in fatalities or any loss. There were no injuries, as opposed to the Bakken incident and the one in Quebec. That, that's one of the problems, is you have the method of transport brings people in contact with the infrastructure a lot more. So I know that's a long-winded answer to your question, but all I can say is yes, it's ongoing. The incidence of rail transport is on the rise relative to pipeline, but the pipeline infrastructure is still, as you know from Keystone, probably the go-to for the large-scale transport of product.
All right, seeing no hands, I'm going to take moderator's privilege and ask them a question I warned them I wanted to hear the answer to, which is in the few minutes remaining, and you do not have to name names. You talked a lot about what is a good response to an environmental emergency. What are some classically one or two horrifically bad responses?
I'll
to
take that on. In my prior life, before I came down here, I worked in Seattle for 25 years. And one of the things that we were hired to do in my old firm was we represented the state of Louisiana with respect to Deepwater Horizon. And, you know, I don't want to cast aspersions to BP because BP is BP and they're not my clients. But I can tell you, having clients who were pursuing that there were a number of missteps. And part of the thing that when I said I was proud of the way Chevron stepped up to the plate, nobody is ever going to say these incidents we plan for them. We think that they're going to take place. The difference, I think, is what happens when the incident takes place. And when you said don't have your CEO be the spokesperson, that's if you ever want proof of that principle, Tony Hayward is the proof. Because he's standing there with supposedly the reins of the company in his hands, complaining that his life is being impacted. I mean, that's just, I don't know how you could make a more classic don't do this than that.
Anybody else want to offer?
I've got a couple of observations, and this Mount Poly tailing spill was a good example in some ways. I think that it's critical in an environmental incident that the focus remain on the incident and response to the incident until you really know what's going on. And in that case, there was kind of there were some early comments about why it happened, and and initially some comments by the company trying to kind of absolve themselves, and immediately the regulators started showing up saying, hey, you ignored this, and engineers started showing up and saying you ignored this warning. Deal with that in order, but first deal with the incident and then take accountability. And actually, the media, if you look at the media stuff, it got better when the CEO of Mount Poly, and when it was the right time for him to speak, did say, look, we take full responsibility for this. So that to me is, but first things first, respond to the incident.
We are now out of time, unless Amanda or David, you want to respond to that? And we are standing between you and lunch, which is set up out there for you. But Michelle.
Since one of the books was mentioned, there's a book list back there of things books you might like to read on this topic, and a failure to learn is on the list, as are some others. So.
Okay, so let's give our panel one last thank you. And enjoy your lunch.